So welcome everyone. I'm Will Milberg, the Dean of the New School for Social Research, and very happy to be here to see my economics colleagues. Hi, Billy. We are in for a real treat tonight. We have the rare chance to hear from an economist who is so often ahead of the curve in thinking about social problems and economic policy responses. The list is long: living wage, monetary policy, environmentally sound economic policy, global minimum wage, taxes on financial transactions, the case against fiscal austerity in a time of stagnation. Bob has been ahead of the curve on all these issues in a creative way, in an engaged way, in an intellectually rigorous way. Tonight's speaker has really been ahead of the pack in thinking about all these issues, and I can't wait to hear the lecture. But I will leave the introduction of the speaker to my colleague Teresa Ghilarducci. I just want to take a minute to introduce the Heilbroner Memorial Lecture on the Future of Capitalism and to talk for a minute about Bob Heilbroner and his legacy at the New School, which I'm always happy to do because he was a close friend and colleague and such an important contributor to the ethos of the economics department and the New School for Social Research for so long. He, of course, wrote most famously The Worldly Philosophers. And in the last edition of The Worldly Philosophers, Bob Heilbroner, we have a lot of Bobs to talk about tonight, Bob Heilbroner wrote a new chapter. I think it was the late 90s was the final edition he wrote. I might have the dates wrong. I couldn't find it on my shelf tonight, which means I lent it to a student, which means return it. Return it, whoever I lent it to. He wrote an extra chapter, and it was called The End of the Worldly Philosopher, ? The Worldly Philosophy, ? And, of course, he meant two things by that. He meant the end, meaning what is the goal of worldly philosophy, and the end, more literally, the culmination. Is it finished? Where he understood worldly philosophy to be political economy inspired by history, institutions, politics, etc. So, and always with Bob, there was the question mark at the end. He always had, in all his titles, some little indication of ambiguity, and it was always the most. He used to always tell the story, and I'm starting to repeat my Heilbroner anecdotes, unfortunately, but he always told the story that his book Marxism For and Against, the most contentious word in the title was "and." And same thing with the question mark in the title of the chapter to the end of the worldly philosophy, ? And it really is a question mark that we're going to contemplate tonight, contemplate throughout the semester, and contemplate, I think, at the student conference coming up. So the two meanings were the goal of the worldly philosophy and the culmination. But a lot has happened since Heilbroner wrote those words in the late 1990s, and even since his death in 2006. As someone once said, I don't know who said this, the future isn't what it used to be. And I think the relevant version of that for tonight is the future of capitalism isn't what it used to be. We don't need to go over the details. I'll leave that for Bob's talk. And the word capitalism has emerged in a way that would surprise Heilbroner as no longer taboo. We use the word capitalism. After 2008, we now talk about its systemic tendencies, about its fragility, about the possibility of saving it or replacing it for the first time. Bob would be quite surprised. And a lot has changed about the way economists talk about capitalism. Bob Gordon in this room was predicting 32 years of stagnation, a neoclassical economist from Northwestern. Piketty and Saez are documenting the historic increase in inequality. Larry Summers, quoted again today in the paper, predicting long-term stagnation with regular financial bubbles. Paul Krugman has become a radical Keynesian. The chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve is a woman. She's concerned that the recovery, now 6 years from the trough in the US, is not over. And a graduate student and his professor at a state university can overturn the widely cited findings by Harvard professors about the perils of government debt. Heilbroner feared that it was the end in the sense of the culmination of the worldly philosophy, understood as political economy inspired by the classicals with an emphasis on distribution and on value, but also with a strong element in Heilbroner's version of history, institutions, and especially of the state, the political. But I would say that the future of political economy isn't what it used to be. There's enormous demand for applied, socially conscious analysis, carefully placed in the context of broader social forces, and I would say more than when Heilbroner was alive. It's not really about understanding math or physics in the Heilbronerian version. As Joan Robinson quipped, "I never learned mathematics, so I was forced to think." It's about understanding capitalism. It's about understanding its history, its dynamics, its social, political, and psychological, both causes and effects. So while tonight we honor Heilbroner, we honor Bob Heilbroner with the lecture in his memory, and a particularly important one because the lecturer tonight was a student of Bob Heilbroner, and because Bob Pollin's work represents to me what is most promising about the future of the worldly philosophy. But we are also extending, I just want to take one more minute and say how we're extending Heilbroner's vision at the New School for Social Research. This semester marked the launch of the Heilbroner Center for the Study of Capitalism, or for Capitalism Studies. I'll get the title right. Julia Ott is here, the director from the history, importantly from the history department. At the moment, the focus of the Heilbroner Center is pedagogical. We have an undergraduate course being taught by an anthropologist and by Julia Ott, historian, and we have a graduate course, which many of you may be in, and I know Teresa is teaching in, which is called Rethinking Capitalism, which brings together faculty, 6 faculty members across 5 disciplines: economics, politics, anthropology, sociology, and history, and about 50 graduate students, including a number of consortium registrants from Columbia and from CUNY, really responding to the uniqueness of this type of course, bringing them together to think through the theoretical and the practical questions of contemporary capitalism. This was Heilbroner's view, that understanding society ultimately required knowledge from a variety of fields in social sciences and even in the humanities. So I'm really pleased that we continue at the NSSR to push ourselves in this direction with the Heilbroner Lecture on the Future of Capitalism, the Heilbroner Center for Capitalism Studies. It's not just that we honor a former colleague, Bob Heilbroner, but that we take on the crucial questions of our day from a position of intellectual strength. Historically, philosophically informed, historically minded, philosophically informed, critical, but open to a variety of views, disciplines, and even approaches to knowledge. Our strength as a unique academic institution, I think, hinges on the success we have in this kind of endeavor, both the Heilbroner Lecture and the Heilbroner Center on Capitalism Studies. We can debate, and we will debate, the end of worldly philosophy, as in the goal. What should political economy be? What is heterodox economics? This is a debate that has been going on in our department for a while, but I'm so pleased to see that the students have organized a full conference around this question. We will debate what is the end of of worldly philosophy. But tonight, we're reminded with Bob Pollin's talk that worldly philosophy is in fact, has in fact quite a bright future. So welcome back to the New School to Bob, but I will leave the full introduction to Teresa Ghilarducci, who will give a proper introduction. And Teresa, everyone knows, is the Schwartz Professor of Economics and the director of the Schwartz Center and the chair of the Economics Department.
Thanks, Will. That was really, I learned a lot. I am Teresa Ghilarducci. I'm the director of the Schwartz Center. Sorry about that, Bob. And I want to thank you very much for all coming here tonight physically, and for our online audience for joining us as well. And on the behalf of the department and the behalf of the Schwartz Center for Economic Policy Analysis, I am here to welcome our very special guest and friend, Bob Pollin. I want to thank our co-sponsors this evening as well. The Social Research Journal, which published our volume on austerity that you'll hear a bit about, and the program in economic policy and sustainable management, environmental policy and sustainable management program headed by Professor Rick McGahey, who's here in the front row. SCEPA's, our center's Age of Austerity series has spent the last several years investigating both the causes and the consequences of this austerity agenda that's been embedded in economic policies here in the United States, in Latin America, and certainly in Europe. And economists from the New School, some of which is articulated in this book, have actually recorded the failed consequences of that agenda. So tonight, we're very deliberate in taking the second step, and that's to say, now what? After the failure of austerity agendas, Robert Pollin, who has just been denoted as a distinguished professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts-Amherst, where he teaches, and he's also the co-director of the Political Economy Research Institute, PERI, at the University of Massachusetts-Amherst. He has taken the first steps towards this question, which is, now what? Last year, many of you know that his research team released a study that went viral within 24 hours of its posting on the website because it debunked the very popular and very powerful Harvard professors Reinhardt and Rogoff's findings that deficits caused all bad things to happen, especially low growth. By revealing the errors, the computational errors in their research, Bob Pollin's research team removed an underpinning for political policies all across the globe that tried to starve social spending to promote economic growth. The intellectual basis for that disappeared. We are really lucky to have you here tonight, Bob. He joins us here tonight to give us this post-austerity view and this post-austerity hope. Now that austerity has proven an economic failure, he'll talk about the policies that will bring us closer to in full employment, economic stabilization, and environmentally stable and sustainable future. Bob has previewed this agenda in his contribution in this book. It's for sale over there, student discount. And his contribution is titled Austerity, the Failed Economics. Our volume is called Austerity, Failed Economics but Persistent Policy. His contribution is titled Austerity Economics and the Struggle, I love this, for the Soul of U.S. Capitalism. He outlines a post-austerity future. But Bob Pollin, let me just tell you a little bit more about him so you know who you're listening to tonight. His extensive research agenda and in past work centers on macroeconomics, conditions for low-wage workers, his analysis of financial markets, a clean energy economy for the U.S., his 2012 book, one of my favorites, it's this one, called Back to Full Employment. This is actually affordable also. It outlines, again, a hopeful future. In addition to teaching economics and co-directing PERI, Bob has worked for a consultant for the U.S. Department of Energy, right in a crucial time when their green job agenda was being promoted, the International Labor Organization, and numerous NGOs on various aspects of building a high employment but green economy. Currently, he is directing a project with the UN's Industrial Development Organization. He has also directed projects on employment creation and poverty reduction in sub-Saharan Africa for the United Nations again. And he's a member of the United States Competitive Policy Council. He is presently a member of the Scientific Advisory Committee of the European Commission Project on Financialization, Economy, Society, and Sustainable Development. For close to a decade, Bob's research had actually had real effect on the ground in passing and promoting living wage policies all across the country in many cities and states. He's one of our department's most distinguished alum, having received his PhD from the Department of Economics. And he was a student of Robert Heilbroner's and a student of a former SCEPA director, David Gordon. Again, I want to thank you all for coming here tonight and thank the online audience. Please, everyone joining us in the discussion on Twitter using the hashtag Pollin. So hashtag Pollin, P-O-L-L-I-N. With my pleasure, Bob, we now come to our lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was supposed to signal to you. Okay. Well, look, thank you both very, very much. I am Extremely honored to be here and to present this lecture in honor of the memory of my former professor, Bob Heilbroner. And I'm very happy that another former professor, Ednell, is here. And this is really something. 3 of my classmates are here. And that's amazing. You know, I started here 39 years ago. And we have, so there's Peter Arno, who is actually now working with me at UMass, and David Howell, who I think was the first person I actually met, my first class here. He introduced himself. We were in David Gordon's class on transition from feudalism to capitalism. And Rick McGahey, who I think we graduated like within a day and a half of each other, something like that, because I remember walking down, I think it was 5th Avenue, and I was kind of semi-drunk because I just was celebrating finishing, and I walked past and I see Rick McGahey at an outdoor cafe, and he also looked semi-drunk. And I said, so what's going on, Rick? And he said, I just finished. I said, oh yeah, so did I. So it's really a fantastic pleasure to be here and to share some ideas and thoughts with all of you today. So let me just start with some thoughts from Bob Heilbroner. So I should say, in addition to tonight, one of the greatest honors I've ever had in my life was that I guess there was a book it was a book of essays on economists, and they asked, Heilbroner was supposed to be profiled, and they asked the various economists who were being profiled to suggest an author. And Heilbroner actually suggested me. So even though I don't really know very much about history of thought or economic philosophy, so I was very, very honored to do this. And it enabled me to actually read, not everything, but because there was a lot, but I really read a lot of Heilbroner. And it reminded me, one of my favorite movies of all time is The Magic Flute by Ingmar Bergman. And at the time, I never thought Ingmar Bergman had a sense of humor, but you must see The Magic Flute and realize that he does. And I saw an interview with Ingmar Bergman, and they said, what inspired you in this movie? And he said, just every day walking into the studio and listening to Mozart. I mean, what else do you need? And that's how I felt when I wrote this essay on Heilbroner, really, that what a thrill to actually, and to actually think that you're like doing something you're supposed to be doing, because I had to write this paper on Heilbroner, and I got to read everything by Heilbroner. So in doing that, one of the observations that actually Teresa and Will were nice enough to mention the Research Institute. I co-direct PERI at UMass, and this is actually our epigraph, that this is what we believe that we're trying to do, and this is something that Heilbroner said. So this is what he thinks we need to be doing as economists, which is too often a vehicle for mystification. Economics can best become an instrument for enlightenment if we see it as the means by which we strive to make a workable science out of morality. So whenever there's some official kind of document that comes out of PERI, this is where we start. Another great observation by Heilbroner is in him trying to think about, okay, how do we advance politically? He came up with this term that I also use all the time, slightly imaginary Sweden. And so what is slightly imaginary Sweden? Well, people have this image of Sweden as this very successful, very egalitarian social democracy that still operates with institutions of capitalism, operates as a liberal democracy. And I took from Heilbroner the idea that, well, you know, achieving, and it doesn't have to be Sweden. And in fact, Sweden doesn't even have to be Sweden, because he says it's slightly imaginary Sweden. The idea that we can construct a society within the set of institutions that we are familiar with, that we don't have to necessarily, at least now, think about, overturning all the institutions that operate today, but to push those institutions in the direction of egalitarianism, in the direction of democracy, and to operate, as Heilbroner said, within the force field of liberal democratic capitalism while pushing those institutions as far as they can go. It seems to me that defines the most clear definition of a viable left political project in our era. And so that really is a guidepost for me and in the types of things I'm also going to talk about in terms of a post-austerity agenda. By the way, if anybody has any comments or questions, we will have a discussion section, but you can, this is the New School after all, so anybody who wants to say anything at any time, that's fine. Okay, austerity economics is in the U.S. So Teresa's and Rick's book, that we already waived it, but it makes clear that austerity economics is very much alive, unfortunately, in the United States, as well as in Europe. Of course, we could do many, many more lectures on conditions in Europe, and Willy Semler, among others, has an excellent essay in here on conditions, austerity conditions in Europe. But rather than to give a very broad perspective, I think we can identify some features of austerity in the U.S. as they are operating right now. So the budget agreement that was signed by President Obama on December the 26th, the day after Christmas, includes cutting pensions for federal employees, including military personnel. And the thing that's gotten a lot of attention, the failure to extend unemployment insurance benefits for 1.3 million long-term unemployed. I know the Democrats are still trying to get this to pass, but it's not passing. There are no loopholes, tax loopholes closed for wealthy, even though this has been a Democratic Party mantra throughout the Obama presidency. Certainly there's been no increase in spending on infrastructure or the green economy, even though, again, this is something that Obama, I think, is truly committed to, at least in what he says, but we don't get it. Food stamp benefits were cut for 47 million people, including 22 million children. This is in the United States today, where we have a GDP of $17 trillion. The rights of working people to organize are under assault all over the place, including in Michigan, where we know Michigan became a right-to-work state in 2012. Michigan, the core of organized labor for generations, became a right-to-work state. So we don't have to get too abstract in talking about what austerity means in the United States. These are enough for me as indicators. Now, I want to put it in the context of the financial crisis. So the financial crisis, as Will referred to and Teresa referred to, starts in officially December 2007, continues officially. The recession itself actually ends in June 2009. So we're 4.5 years into a recovery. It's really important to remember that. We keep talking about the Great Recession, but we really need to talk about the failed recovery. And we can see this in terms of the unemployment figures. So this lower line is the official unemployment rate, called U3, which is the rate, it does not include people who are underemployed or discouraged. And we can see the spike. If you can see the shadings, those are the recession periods. So we have this spike up to almost 10%. But what distinguishes it from the last time we had a spike, 80-82, up to 10%, we saw that unemployment fell very quickly. You had a recovery in which employment actually recovered. Now, what we're seeing here is that the recovery from the spike due to the recession has been very, very slow, uneven, inadequate. Now, and then this line is the broader measure. This is the official Department of Labor statistics. The official U6 measure, which includes people who are underemployed and discouraged. Underemployed means if you're you want a full-time job and you get 5 hours a week, you're employed according to this U3. But this measure includes people that are seeking full-time and getting very, very part-time. So this one spikes up to almost 15%. So that's about 25 million people. This is the thing, if you remember the 2012 election, Romney actually kept talking about this number. He'd say, the real unemployment crisis is this number. Unfortunately, I agreed with him. Now, that's come down. The latest number is 12.7%. The 12.7% is still, sorry. Yeah, it's still almost 21 million people. So that's 21 million people. 21 million people. You think about all the entire population of New York City. Okay, everybody. Then you double that. Then you add LA. That's 21 million people. So think about all those people. That's the employment crisis today, not at the peak of the recession. That's 4.5 years into a recovery. So obviously, what we are experiencing, both in terms of government policy with respect to austerity and with respect to the labor market, is a very severe crisis and attack on well-being, living standards of people, ordinary people, working people in this economy. And we can also see this through, this is the employment to population ratio. Now we know that the unemployment rate has fallen to 6.6%, which, by the way, is now very close to the number that the Fed, under Bernanke, with Yellen as the associate, the vice chair of the Fed, was saying that was basically the number they wanted to get the economy to before they would stop any kind of stimulus measures. And I'll talk about those a little later. But so we're actually almost there. We are effectively there. But what has gotten us there is people dropping out of the labor force. So that what happened as part of the crisis was that you're up at about 63.5% of the total population is employed. That drops to about 53.3%, and that's more or less where we are now. If we were today to put all the people, if we were to raise the employment population ratio back to where it was in 2007, that would mean 14 more million people would be employed. So that's a better measure. I mean, the two measures, that we have 21 million people who are U6 unemployed according to the Department of Labor. That is either officially unemployed, discouraged, or underemployed. And then in addition, we have this issue of the people that have dropped out. That's 14 million. That's, I think, giving us a good sense of the magnitude of the ongoing crisis. And just some quick calculations that I made, just a simple extrapolation. What if we were to get the economy back to 5% or even 4% unemployment at the current pace of recovery, and we would get to 5% by June 7, 2017. So that would be a full 6 years after the recovery. To get to 4% unemployment at the current rate, it would be March 2019. So we are not exactly well organized, and we don't have a trajectory to achieve a full employment economy. Now, what happened and how we got to the ascendancy of austerity economics was that fiscal deficits did rise during the recession. There's no debate about that. Well, actually, there was a slight debate. The last time I was speaking here was in June, and I was on a panel with Barney Frank. And I want to I'm going to get back at Barney because he wouldn't let me speak. So here's the thing. You can say whatever you want about... Okay. You can say whatever you want about the Bush administration and the Bush tax cuts and the Bush fighting 2 wars without raising revenue. The fact is, before the economic crisis, the fiscal deficit was 1.2% of GDP. This is what I'm showing you. Federal deficits as a share of GDP. The average from 1950 to 2012 is 2.2%, so around 2%. It's a long-term average. Actually, under Bush in 2007, we were below the trend. So this was my beef with Barney Frank in June, because he was saying the deficits were caused by Bush. Not true. And I said, Barney, no. And he said, yes. So, but it wasn't exactly a scientific exchange. He said yes, and then it was time to move on. But anyway, look, so we did get a spike in the fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit is at 10.1% in 2009 as a consequence of the crisis. Number one, tax revenues go down. Number two, government spending has to go up just automatically to cover unemployment insurance, to cover social spending that goes up automatically. So the deficit goes to 10.1% of GDP, which is historically high. There's no debate about that. We have not had a deficit of this magnitude as a share of GDP since World War II, never in peacetime. And then it hovers in that range for at least 2010, 2011. It starts to come down. Now, 2013, the projection is, we're at 4.1%. In 2014, the estimate of the Congressional Budget Office is we're at 3.3%. We're getting back to the historic level. We're getting there through the austerity agenda in large part. But so the point is, though, that the austerity hawks said that the crisis of the economy ultimately was not an employment crisis. It was not a crisis that we can't cover food stamps at an adequate level for 47 million people. This is the crisis. Okay, that everything else has to bow before the fundamental point that we can't sustain deficits at this level. So the austerity hawks' argument was that we cannot continue to fight mass unemployment with large-scale fiscal deficits, and that the deficits themselves, that is the crisis. Okay, so the debate shifts entirely from what happened. And I'm not getting into the causes of the recession. We could later if you want. I think they're fairly obvious that the proximate causes Wall Street hyper-speculation. But that's not even the discussion. The discussion is profligacy by the federal government. And why is that so bad? Well, because according to the deficit hawks of 2009, it was going to cause these things: high inflation, rising interest rates, and GDP growth. And also, Jeff Madrick is here. Jeff actually asked me to write an article and challenge, which gave me the opportunity to review all these debates carefully for the first time. So thank you, Jeff. So what happened with those arguments? Well, we can do it very quickly. Inflation didn't go up. Inflation went down. So we didn't really mean that, but they did mean it. The argument was these deficits were going to be highly inflationary. And in fact, inflation, the trend from 1953 to 2008, 3.8%, goes down to 1.6%. Interest rates going to spike because there's a crowding out effect of government deficits. So the 5-year Treasury, 1953 to 2008, is 6.2%. 2009 to 2012 is 1.6%. Actually, now it's a little lower. So yes, something could happen in the future. But what we're talking about is that over the period from the peak of the recession to the present, the recovery, these things that they said were going to happen simply did not happen. They were wrong. The fiscal hawks, the Austerians, the ones who say we can't afford food stamps anymore, on their basic macroeconomic arguments were wrong on these. Now, the other one, now it's true that the government debt did grow. The government debt grew because the government borrowed more money. And so we see the government debt growing here as a share of GDP. But at the same time, actually, interest payments on the debt. Now, when we talk about a fiscal crisis, I mean, the common sense way, like if we think about Greece, for example, is government is not going to be able to cover its obligations in 3 months, 6 months, or it's going to squeeze out everything else you want to do. Well, actually, the interest burden actually is at a historic low, not a historic high, a historic low. And that's for the simple reason that the interest rate is so low. So you can borrow $1 trillion, and if the interest rate is 0, then how much do you pay in interest? 0. So that is basically what has happened. And yes, there are projections that the interest payments are going to go up because obviously the rates can't stay this low. And that could happen. Historically, there's evidence to think that it could happen. But it hasn't happened. And the fact that it hasn't happened enables us to think about more fiscal space, not about austerity being the only priority. Now, then there's the other argument. So this one's kind of fun because, as Teresa said, this argument, the real problem is that the debt, when the government debt gets high, it reaches a threshold, exceeds 90% of GDP, you're in really bad trouble. Economic growth collapses. And this is this famous work, highly influential work by Professors Reinhardt and Rogoff at Harvard. Just wrong. Just like the other stuff. You know, they said inflation is going to take off, interest rates are going to spike. Wrong, wrong. Okay, Reinhardt and Rogoff, they are the purveyors of this argument. They're very prestigious. The paper is in the American Economic Review. It's just totally wrong. So, and that's essentially what we discovered. It was, Teresa was nice enough to say it was a research team. It was a graduate student paper in a class, and he couldn't replicate it. And we were writing up a paper. In fact, Teresa was at my house the night we were finishing the paper. We were having a party for Teresa. I had to leave. I had to move, go away for like 20 minutes. It wasn't very hard to write this paper, by the way, because their thing was so bad. So here's what they said. So this is the picture they had. Okay, this is these government debt as a share of GDP when it's less than 30%, 30 to 60%, 60 to 90%. And then it shows what happens to GDP growth. And this is for 20 countries, advanced economies over the period 1946 to 2009. And they say, look, okay, this is what you're dealing with. So you can care about food stamps, you can care about unemployment insurance, but once you hit that threshold, the economy is going to stop growing and it's going to go negative, so you're not going to be able to accomplish any of these things. And that's really the problem that you're facing when you're irresponsible about the debt. Now, it just was wrong. This isn't any deep argument. It was just wrong. So what we discovered was the thing that got most attention was, yes, they made an Excel coding error. I mean, they really screwed up. But that actually wasn't, that was the thing that was the easiest to think about, but they actually they excluded available data. And by the way, they admit that they made the Excel coding error. They defend these other 2 points. The exclusion of available data, and the way that they weighted things. So for example, it's again very easy to explain. Every country counted as one observation, no matter how many years they had high debt. So there was, New Zealand had 1 year of high debt out of 1946 to 2009. 1 year. And it so happened that year the economic growth was negative 7.6%. So that counted equally to Great Britain having 19 years of government debt over 90% of GDP. And And in Britain, the economy grew at 4.5% for 19 years of this. So the 19 years in Britain, and by the way, we're talking about New Zealand here. I'm sorry if anybody's from New Zealand, but you know, do we really want to draw big generalizations about New Zealand in 1951? So, but they did, and they continue to defend it. So those were the problems. So when we corrected it, did I do something wrong here? Yeah. Hello? Okay. So here's when we corrected it. So we are HAP, Herndon, Ash, and Pollin. The story that we told in April was, this number is just wrong. This is the real number. So yes, the GDP growth average is not negative 0.1, but positive 2.2. So it's not really a big crisis. So, okay, I'll just, yeah. But they came back and said, well, but still, look, it's a negative, the growth does decline by an average of 1 percentage point, which is a big deal. That's still a big deal. Okay, maybe this extreme thing wasn't right, but let's forget about that. Okay, let's move on. So then they said, look, if you do some other things that with our paper, you only looked at, you know, you were cherry picking. You took the results that gave your argument the best, the best results for you. But if you do some other things, actually, we consistently show that GDP growth will fall by an average of 1 percentage point. Turned out that also wasn't true. And by the way, this was not in a journal. The New York Times basically gave Reinhardt and Rogoff the whole newspaper for a day to defend themselves. And this is what they came up with. And so here's, I'm going to flash these real quick because we don't need to spend a lot of time. But actually their own, they had an errata that in response to us. So they actually found that they themselves, without highlighting this, that using medians instead of means, that the actual growth decline from the 60 to 90% category to the highest category was not 1 percentage point. It was 0.4 of a percentage point. You know, within a margin of error here. This is Reinhardt and Rogoff's own finding. If you read their errata, they don't exactly make a big deal out of this. It's buried, but there it is. That's their own finding. Now, if we do a couple other things quickly, so we took their long. They said, look at the long time series, 1790 to 2009, and now the difference that we found was between 2.5% and 2.1%. But then we also did a robustness check, a simple robustness check. Said, well, what if we split? Well, you know, there's nothing magical about above 90%. So what if we split the above 90 into 2 categories? And actually, there is no difference whatsoever in the growth average between the 60 to 90 and a 90 and 120% GDP growth category. And this other one, above 120%, there's very few observations. Okay, there's nothing here. There's nothing here. And then we said, oh, let's take one final run at this and say, what if we actually just think about the most recent time period, the one that's most relevant for thinking about austerity policies in the US today? And here's what you get. Actually, the average growth rate for the above 90 is higher than the 60 to 90, and it's about the same as the 30 to 60 debt to GDP categories. In other words, there is absolutely nothing that holds up in this paper. Nothing. So when we think, again, I think about Heilbroner here, and he's saying, you know, turning economics into a workable science of morality. Workable science is critical here. I mean, you have to be scientific. So scientifically, there's nothing in their results whatsoever. Okay, so let's forget about them for now. They're very unpleasant experiences I've had. They actually, Rogoff decided that the best way to defend himself was to attack my character And my co-author's character, I'm serious. If you want to read about it, I wrote it up. I mean, it's absurd stuff. He can't defend the research, so he says, oh, these leftists, they're leftists, they're smearing me. You know, it's just silly stuff. Anyway, now let's get serious here. Let's think about a post-austerity agenda. So the question, of course, is it true that countries are approaching a danger point when public debt reaches 90% of GDP? And the answer is no. I mean, may well be conditions, and I'm not like in favor of big government deficits. As a matter of principle, I'm not, and I never was, and I never interpreted Keynes that way. I never interpreted Hyman Minsky that way. I think there are uses, and I brought this outstanding book called The Debt and the Deficit. False Hopes, Real Possibilities. It sounds like this is what we need to be reading today. It's very contemporary, except it was written in 1989 by Bob Heilbroner and his co-author Peter Bernstein. And Heilbroner and Bernstein, this was actually an update of a book they wrote in 1963 called A Primer on Government Spending. So if you want to think seriously about the uses of government deficits, you should read this. Don't bother with Reinhardt and Rogoff. Read this. This is an outstanding, short and characteristically of Heilbroner, very clear, gets you right to the point, and thinks about government deficits in terms of the positive roles that they can play and the real issues, the real dangers. I myself had a few disputes with this. I actually reviewed this book when it came out in The Nation magazine. And Bob sent me this book. You can just, if you don't believe me. Okay, where is it? Okay, you can see this, okay? That's the inscription. And Bob writes for Bob Pollin, with warm regards and in the appropriate color of ink, red. So, and here's Bob Heilbroner, the person. I wrote this review, and Rick McGahee was somehow found it online just an hour ago. I don't even remember what I said. I remember that I had some arguments on some points. But when the article came out, Bob Heilbroner was in the habit, this is pre-email, not too far pre-email, but always pre-email. Bob Heilbroner was in the habit of writing postcards to people. And he would just scribble a few words. And occasionally I would get one, and it was extremely generous of him to do so. And my article comes out in The Nation, and I said it's an excellent book. I had some issues. And I don't know, 5 days later, this is pre-email, I get a postcard. And Bob says, fantastic review. I agree with the whole thing, especially your criticisms. So where are such people? That he wanted to learn. He was open. He was supportive, especially of students. Will mentioned his book, Marxism For and Against, and the book was dedicated to his students, and that was Bob Heilbroner. So if we're going to think seriously about public deficits and debts, it's a much better place to start than the massive literature from austerity hawks. And I'm not even going to get into John Taylor from Stanford, who's actually, if we want to say that Reinhardt and Rogoff are completely wrong, Taylor is laughably wrong, and it's not even worth discussing. Okay, so what about post-austerity agenda? Full employment and environmental sustainability. So I want to just outline a few things quickly. So yes, full employment at decent wages. What does that mean? Oh, sure, yeah, buy my book and you'll get the whole story there. Let's not focus too much on that. I want to get into actually some more detailed things. But the idea is, you saw the numbers on unemployment in terms of the broader measure, currently at 12.7%, 21 million people. What if we thought about getting that number to below 4%? To me, that's something close to a slightly imaginary Sweden version of a full employment economy that absorbs everything except mostly the frictional unemployment. Now, what about fiscal policy to get us there? Well, obviously, what the lesson from Reinhardt and Rogoff, the negative lesson, and the positive lesson from Heilbroner and many, many others, is the centrality of being flexible. I mean, that was the idea of the whole notion, starting from Keynes, of course, but then Abba Lerner coined the term functional finance. The notion of functional finance, the deficits are neither, it's not good or bad. There's no moral issue here, not intrinsically good or bad, but what is the purpose that they're serving? So one of the really good things about Heilbroner's book, criticizing Keynes, actually was to say that, well, it actually does matter what the government spends on. Because Keynes famously, of course he was being provocative, but he said, look, if the government, hires people to dig holes in a depression, bury money, cover it up, and then hires other people to dig it up, and then release the money, that's going to be a stimulus. And, that may be true, but what Heilbroner correctly says is it actually matters what you spend on. So if we're going to invest in public infrastructure, if we're going to invest in the green economy, and by the way, Heilbroner was extremely visionary in talking about environmental issues. So if we're going to do deficit spending, let's make sure that the government is spending it on useful things. There's no reason not to. A simple point, but something that we need to frame a broader agenda. And let me also then, I want to focus on a few other policy interventions, which is more in the realm of monetary policy, mobilizing commercial banks' excess reserves, taxing Wall Street, raising the minimum wage, and investing in green economy and how we do that. So let's just run through those quickly. So the basic point on the commercial banks and monetary policy is, as a result of the Federal Reserve holding the short-term interest rate, the interbank lending rate, the so-called federal funds rate, at zero, now for 4 years, banks can borrow at zero. Essentially, they can borrow an unlimited amount at zero. And on top of that, through the quantitative easing program by which the Fed was buying longer-term government bonds in exchange for cash as a stimulus, the commercial banks loaded up with cash reserves, a cash hoard. And I'm showing what the numbers are. Yet Teresa mentioned my book, and when I wrote the book, we were about here. Now, I thought it was going to go down, but as of the most recent data, the commercial banks, and I'm not talking about government bonds, I'm not talking about speculation in Brazil, the carry trade, or anything like that. I'm talking about cash reserves held by commercial banks at the Federal Reserve. The number is $2.2 trillion. That's 14% of U.S. GDP. 14% of U.S. GDP, the equivalent, is being held by commercial banks. And I'm not talking about investment banks here either. I'm not talking about Goldman Sachs. I'm talking about the commercial banks are holding 14% of U.S. GDP that they got for free, and they're not lending it. So here's a simple policy proposal. Make the banks lend at least some significant share. You can see that in 2007, right at the crisis, what the bank reserve level was $20.8 billion. Essentially, the banks had no reserves. And that was part of the crisis, was that they had no cash cushion to cover themselves when they were facing defaults. So 20 billion is way too low. 2.2 trillion is way too high. I've done some calculations as to what might be a reasonable number if you took very extreme estimates as to what default rates are going to be on mortgages and so forth. what should be an appropriate cash cushion, somewhere in the range of 600 billion would be an extremely cautious level of cash reserves. So we're holding about $1.5 trillion more the banks than is needed to cover any conceivable crisis that they would face. So the point is that the banks need to start lending this. On top of that, the banks get paid 25 basis points, 0.25% by the Fed to hold this money. You could say, well, that's just a little bit of money, but when you're looking at $2.2 trillion, it's going to add up. And it's completely riskless. It's money they got for free. At the same time, the corporate sector is also awash with cash and is able to make loans and market their bonds. But the small business sector has basically been starved for credit since the recession. Now, that's what this shows. We're basically at literally zero lending to small businesses on net. These are figures from the Federal Reserve. So the argument is, well, come on, the banks are in business to make money. If they saw profitable opportunities, they would start lending. They wouldn't just hold cash. That's true. But their perceptions as to what constitutes a profitable opportunity no longer include small businesses because they don't even know how to undertake the transactions that they don't have the capacity to do it that they once did because they're too busy engaging in more profitable speculative activities. And as a result, we've seen the small business sector starved. So, survey evidence from small businesses supports this, including surveys from the Federal Reserve, that credit rationing is taking place. So the proposal that I've made, and it's not just me, Alan Blinder, who was vice chair of the Fed, has proposed versions of this. Other people have as well, which is to tax the excess bank reserves. So what's the tax rate? Well, we don't know, but set a tax and keep the tax there until the banks shift their incentives and start making loans and start undertaking the type of activity that they need to take, build the infrastructure to make and seek out profitable lending opportunities for themselves with small business. It's true what Republicans say. Small businesses are the biggest, dollar for dollar, biggest single source of employment. It's more labor intensive. And that is a major reason why we have such a weak employment recovery, because small business doesn't have the means to expand. And so I say a carrot and stick approach. The carrot would be to extend loan guarantees to small businesses. We already have a loan guarantee program. Extend it. That seems like an easy, slightly imaginary Sweden type program. So it would be easy, I think. We're talking about 2.2 trillion. It would be easy to move in the range of 400 billion back into the economy through this channel, which is a number that's equivalent to the 2009 stimulus on an annual basis. Okay, idea number one. Second, idea number two, tax Wall Street. Again, hardly an original idea with me. It is in the general theory. James Tobin, Nobel Prize winning economist, proposed a version of this in the 1970s. There is a version now before Congress. Now, there's actually two. I like one better. Just full disclosure, I did help draft it, so probably why I like it better. The real reason I like it better is because it's a higher tax rate and it raises more revenue. And it's Congressman Keith Ellison is the sponsor of the bill. The issue is what tax rate should you tax Wall Street transactions? And I'm talking about all financial transactions, just like everything except food and I guess medicine you have to pay sales tax. In New York, it's what, 6.5%? Oh, sorry. Okay. Okay, so 8.2? 875. Okay, so I'm talking about, let's start with a tax on stocks at 0.5%, 50 basis points. Now, I'm not pulling that number out of the air. Actually, in the UK today, they have a tax at that rate now. Now, you can say what you want about, the UK financial system. It is more or less no better or no worse than the US system, and they operate with this tax and have for generations. And it raises a lot of revenue. So let's start with that tax rate. Then what I proposed in this bill with Congressman Ellison was lower rates, actually, on bonds, all bond transactions and all derivative transactions. So the bond rate on this bill is 10 basis points. That's the rate that is proposed in the European Union now for bond transactions. And then I said, well, the derivatives are mostly derivatives on bonds, options, futures on bonds, and the notional value. So if you have a $100 bond and a derivative, an option would say, you have the right to buy that bond in 2 years. Generally are valued, that right to buy the bond is generally valued at roughly 4% of the underlying value. Let's say if it's a $100 bond, it would take $4 to buy this derivative, this right to buy the bond. So we say, well, okay, then let's set the tax rate on derivatives at 4% of the value on the bonds, roughly. So that's how we get these rates. 50 basis points on stocks, 10 basis points on bonds, a half a basis point on derivatives. How much money do you raise? You raise $300 billion a year, assuming that trading falls by 50%. Now, that is probably implausibly high. I don't think it would be bad if trading fell by 50%, but assuming trading fell by 50%, you would still generate in the range of $300 billion a year, which happens to be about 80% of the projected fiscal deficit for 2015. So let's say you really were serious about eliminating fiscal deficits in this country and running a balanced budget except during financial crises. You can do it. But you have to tax the people that have a lot of money and stop thinking about it as, the means through which we cut food stamps. Nobody on Wall Street is really going to end up starving through having to pay, half a basis point on a derivative transaction. And the result is it could be transformative in terms of fiscal policy issues. One of the organizations that is most strongly supporting this is the National Nurses Union, of all people. Why they think that this is the means through which we can start funding social spending again in a decent way. They would be very upset with me for saying what we could do with this is eliminate the fiscal deficit for the most part. They say we should be spending it on healthcare, fighting AIDS, building the green economy, and I agree with them. And running a fiscal deficit, a historic fiscal deficit in the range of 2% of GDP presents no problem at all. So this is a very aggressive, hawkish kind of fiscal approach. But anyway, it can easily be done. There is no reason to think that you can't control the fiscal deficit except when you need to counteract recessions. Okay, a third issue is the minimum wage, which has gotten a lot of attention, including Obama's, somebody, maybe you told me, he has signed today an executive order raising the minimum wage for federal contractors to $10.10. So this is a very important step forward that it's getting so much attention, and Obama even used the term living wage in his State of the Union address 2 weeks ago. So I want to just give you a little quick perspective on where we are. The minimum wage today, federal, is $7.25. Correcting for inflation, in 1968, the minimum wage in this country was $10.71 an hour. The absolute rock bottom minimum, I'm not talking about in states that are more generous. I'm talking about if a 16-year-old girl shows up for work, her first day at McDonald's in Abilene, Texas, and yes, I am picking on Texas, she had to be paid $10.71 an hour. That was in 1968. So the idea of a 10-10 that Obama's talking about, it's certainly an improvement, but we have to understand this historically, that it has been a massive attack on working people, that we have allowed the minimum wage to decline so severely. And of course, there's important people working on this as connected to the broader problem of rising inequality, including Professor David Howell. So you should all read his study that's with the Center for American Progress, and also the version of it in this book. Okay, how high should the minimum wage really go? So we have Obama's proposal for 10-10. Congressman Alan Grayson has a 10-50 proposal, which is moderately better. The city council, new city council member in Seattle, whose name I probably am going to really screw up, Kashami Sawant, who is an economist, by the way, she's proposed $15 an hour for Seattle, and it's almost certainly going to pass in Seattle. That was also the number, if you read about what really got the discussion going on minimum wages, was the courageous actions of fast food workers over the last year going out on strike and saying they deserved a $15 wage. So that's how $15 got into the discussion. That's how the discussion really got started in the first place. Now, let's say $15 sounds outrageously high. I mean, we're at $7.25. Now, again, let me put this in perspective. So you saw in 1968, the minimum wage in this country, the rock bottom minimum was $10.71. Now, what if we allowed the minimum wage from 68 on to only rise at a rate equal to average labor productivity growth? No faster. So if you think about labor negotiations, the owners, business say, we can allow wage increases, but we can't allow wage increases faster than productivity. So I'm saying, let's not allow the minimum wage to go up faster than productivity. Let's allow minimum wage to go up at the rate of productivity growth. The minimum wage today in the United States would be $26.24. So that sets the range. I don't know that number is, I know actually that it is not politically realistic, but we need to keep that in mind. If the country just stayed where it was from 1968 moving forward and made the adjustment for productivity, the minimum wage would be $26 an hour today. Now, the problem, of course, people say, is that we raise the minimum wage, that makes you feel good, it makes politicians feel good, but it actually does more harm than good. The unintended consequence is unemployment. And we can't really get into all the research, but I have a wonderful way of summarizing it. So Richard Freeman, an eminent Harvard labor economist, said this in 1996, and it applies even more today over the debate. The debate is over whether modest minimum wage increases have no employment effect, modest positive effects, or small negative effects. It is not about whether or not there are large negative effects. There is, like Reinhardt and Rogoff, there is no evidence that raising the minimum wage and moderate adjustments causes unemployment. As much as economists say that, let's again think about making a workable science out of morality here. And a workable science says, let's actually study the question and see if it's true, not just draw graphs. I drew the graph actually in my class Monday because I teach this intro class. I drew the graph. I said, see, it causes unemployment, except that the graph doesn't take account of this small detail, which is in Latin, ceteris paribus, all else equal. All else is not equal after you raise the minimum wage, and that's why a rise in the minimum wage does not cause, there's no evidence that it causes unemployment. Now, why? Very, very quickly. There's a lot of reasons, but I want to give one that I think is evocative, which is that businesses don't necessarily want to lay off workers. If the businesses has a market, they probably want to at least maintain the level of operations or expand. And if they face higher costs, before they start laying off workers, they probably would try to raise their prices. So here's an exercise I did last summer, thinking about the $10.50 minimum wage with Jeanette Wicks-Lim, my co-worker at PERI. Here's the question. Think about a fast food restaurant. And I'm not thinking about education. I'm not thinking about retail. I'm not thinking about high tech. I'm thinking about fast food, where you have the highest concentration of low-wage workers. And here's the exercise. If you raised everybody in the fast food sector from where they are right now to $10.50, what would be the impact on overall costs for fast food restaurants? And the answer is it would increase overall cost by 2.7%. Now, I know this sometimes sounds implausible, but it's true. I can send you the full references. And the reason, of course, is, number one, people aren't at the rock bottom minimum wage for the most part to begin with. Number two, yes, there's a high concentration of low-wage workers, but there's also higher paid workers that are a big part of cost. Number three, there's other costs. There's real estate, there's materials, and so forth. So this is the answer. When I put this out, and actually the Daily Beast ran this feature based on our research, and this guy who writes for the Columbia Journalism Review named Ryan Chittum said, this is the absolute biggest piece of garbage I've ever seen. You know, he's a true scientist. He said this is garbage. He knows it's garbage. And then we reran all the numbers and we presented it to him. We said, we'd like you to retract. Unless you can tell me what's wrong with our research, retract. Never heard a word from Ryan Chittum again. But anyway, it's true. So the point is, look, if we were to say we're going to fully pass on the costs to consumers, what does it mean in terms of the price of a Big Mac? The price of a Big Mac goes from $4 to $4.11. That's what it means. And these are therefore modest adjustments that are easily handled by businesses. And if you also said, what if in part, when you raise the minimum wage, productivity goes up because you have lower turnover and less absenteeism? And in part, yes, let's say McDonald's profits are going to go down modestly. Then we're saying, well, then the price of the Big Mac only goes from $4 to $4.05. That's what we're talking about. And that is precisely why, even though you say, yes, when the price of something goes up, the demand goes down, that's the law of demand, the scientific question is, by how much is demand going to go down, and under what conditions? And how much is the price going to go up? These are the things that were not asked for generations when the economists were saying that it's scientifically irrefutable that minimum wage causes unemployment. So I won't say what the right number is because I don't know where the minimum wage should go. But we have, just like in terms of fiscal space, we have a lot of room to raise the minimum wage without inducing unemployment. There is a number, yes, there is a number at which point the minimum wage will induce unemployment. And if we are doing a workable science here, we would do the research to figure out what that number is. But we know it's not 1010, we know it's not 1050. Okay, last thing, green economy. I'm giving you some just some basic evidence of a large research project that I've been doing with the Center for American Progress. So what you're looking at are these bars are the level of total energy consumption, first in the United States, actual in 2010, and then a set of projections for 2030. So the actual level of total energy consumption in the United States, and the colors in the bars are the sources of energy. And if we're concerned about climate change, we obviously are most concerned about fossil fuel energy generating CO2 emissions. So total energy consumption in the United States today is about 100 quadrillion BTUs. It's a nice round number, 98.2. You can say 100, roughly 100 quadrillion BTUs is total energy consumption from all sources. Now, the Department of Energy, what they call their reference case, what they think is most probably going to happen between now and 2030, says that we're actually going to get much more efficient in our use of energy, such that between 2011 and 2030, we're only going to go up by 6 quadrillion BTUs, from 98 to 104. So very modest, even while they project economic growth at rising at about 2.5% a year. Okay, so just keep that in mind. The next projection as to what energy is going to be at, I looked at all the programs that Obama is proposing for energy efficiency, renewable energy, and I said, let's say all these things are working like full tilt. What is Obama really, really talking about in the most optimistic scenario for Obama's 2030 case? And that would be that instead of going up by 6 quadrillion BTUs to 104, that we would actually be going down in absolute terms by 2030 to 94 quadrillion BTUs. Okay? And then the last bar is the number that I actually think as you'll see why in a second, where we actually have to get to have any chance of controlling climate change, which is we need to get to 70. We're at 100, thereabouts. The U.S. economy has to cut total energy consumption to about 70 quadrillion BTUs, and I'll show you why. Okay, so to meet even the Obama administration's own intermediate targets for emission reduction by 2030, that number is 3,200 million metric tons. That's where we need to be by 2030. Okay. Now, if you look at the energy mix, our actual for 2010, and then the Energy Department's projection for 2030, and then even the most aggressive Obama case, where we're pushing renewable energy and we're cutting way back on coal, okay? The 2030 number under the reference case is 5,733 million metric tons. So we're doomed. Basically, you're saying that under the most likely scenario, according to the U.S. Energy Department, there is no chance of controlling climate change. It's just not going to happen, not even close. Under the most aggressive case that one could make on behalf of Obama, we're at 4,400 and some million metric tons. We're about 30% above where we need to be. That is the most aggressive, optimistic case. The only way that we have any chance of meeting the emission reduction standard is, number one, to become much more energy efficient, even while the economy is growing, and to basically triple our reliance on clean renewable energy, on solar, wind, some hydro, some bioenergy, geothermal. That's basically, so that's the number, that's how you get to hitting the 2030 emission target. So this is a super aggressive kind of scenario, but in fact it's the only one that has any chance of achieving control or even being on the trajectory to control climate change by 2050. This is not very well known, and I hope it gets to be well known when our study finally comes out. So, but here's the next punchline, which is, how do you get there? The only way you can achieve environmental sustainability is to cut back on economic growth and kill jobs. And the answer is actually no. And the reason is that, just think of, in real simple terms, think about an environmental transformation as a massive infrastructure project or a massive industrial policy project. And when we think about those things, or even when we think about military spending, even Republicans, they say, you can't cut military spending because that would hurt jobs. So what if we thought, well, why is it just military spending? Why not spending on the environment? Well, and it turns out that spending on the environment generates about 3 times more jobs per dollar of expenditure than maintaining our existing fossil fuel infrastructure. This is results out of the U.S. input-output tables. That clean energy investments generates about 17 jobs per dollars of expenditure, whereas maintaining our fossil fuel system generates about 5.5 jobs per $1 million of expenditure. So 3 times more jobs. So this scenario that I talk about is a pro-jobs agenda, and it's a pro-environment agenda, and it is part of the path through which we can get to a full employment, environmentally sustainable economy. And so what is to be done? I'll just repeat Bob Heilbroner's outstanding words, which you've heard many times, but too often a vehicle for mystification, economics can best become an instrument for enlightenment if we see it as the means by which we strive to make a workable science out of morality. Keep it up here, and we'll do our bit in other places too. Thank you. Sure.
Bob, you have about a half an hour for questions.
Sure.
Why don't you go ahead and field them?
Sure, sure, yeah.
Hi, so I'm very, sympathetic.
Wait for the mic.
Sure.
And Professor Ott will speak first, but we really want to give some privilege to students too. And you have to guess who they are.
So I'm very sympathetic, but I want to be very informed and educated as well. So 2 questions. When you do the calculation or the projections about what raising the minimum wage would do to the price of a hamburger, for example, a Big Mac, for example, do you take into account all the minimum wages that are raised for the suppliers of McDonald's, like debt through, okay, so you do that. And then you addressed why it's not bad for raising the minimum wage wouldn't be destructive to employment, but you didn't talk about inflation, because that's the other big problem that conservatives would raise.
Well, obviously.
And, can I just, okay, and then on the finance stuff, what's your argument against the claim that a financial transaction tax would drive trading to other markets?
On the minimum wage, so the issue on inflation, obviously what I'm saying that part of the solution is actually some modest increase in prices. Now, remember that I said it was 2.7% for fast food, assuming the full cost pass-through occurs, which is, again, a strong assumption. There's no reason why it would have to be a full cost pass-through. But that's also the fast food industry, and that's the highest proportion of any industry. So some other calculations we did, we said exactly your question. What would it mean? What would it mean? Because for low-wage workers, how would it affect them? Because other prices are going to go up. So how much net gain do they get? If they're going to get a 40% wage increase, how much are they going to have to cover in terms of higher prices? And in particular, one thing we calculated was food prices. And the answer was for something like a 40% wage increase overall, because now we're feeding it back through the whole economy, right? It's not just the high concentration fast food restaurants. It's on the order of 0.7% price increase. So if you say you're going to get a 40% raise and that your basket is going to go up by less than 1%, the net gain is very substantial. So the overall distributive effect, to put it crudely, is a minimum wage increase, assuming it's a cost pass-through in prices, redistributes income from the middle class to the working class and poor. And that's basically what's going on. If you had a cost pass-through that was half, some of it was absorbed in productivity, some of it was absorbed in businesses taking lower profits, then it would be a cost pass. Still mostly, it's basically a redistribution. It is not getting at the 1%, because the 1% don't go to fast food restaurants too much, or they have their own. But that's basic, and I think it's a good policy for that. That's what basically happened. On the transaction tax, well, yeah, Great Britain is running a financial market with a transaction tax. The 7 fastest growing financial markets all operate with transaction taxes. China, Singapore, Taiwan, Russia, I can't remember all of them, but they're all operating with transaction taxes. So again, analytically, I can see how the argument might be reasonable, but let's take a scientific approach. What's the evidence? I was in a debate a couple of years ago that Ralph Nader set up with somebody from Georgetown University on this. It was like this drag out thing for 2 hours. And he brought up all these issues. And he actually didn't have any evidence. He was, he's some big professor at Georgetown and finance, well known, and he could not defend, he could defend them analytically, he could tell good stories. He didn't bother with any evidence.
Hi. I think you made a great case for why certain policies could be enacted or should be enacted. My question is, if these cases are strong, also on an analytical, academic level, what's hindering them?
Why aren't they being implemented? Well, you could probably answer that as well, or not better than me. What are the means? Heilbroner is talking about a workable science out of morality, but he doesn't say what the politics are of making these things happen. And obviously there's a lot of resistance. The argument about the transaction tax, yeah, it's going to ruin the financial markets. Of course, Wall Street doesn't want to pay it. They just don't want to pay it. They would rather see 47 million people get their food stamps cut. That's evident. There's this great quote from Schumpeter. We had a speaker at UMass just yesterday, and I asked her to send me the quote because she used it in her talk. And if you want, I'll get it off my cell phone. But the essence of it is, look at look at government budgets. You don't need to hear all the rhetoric of politicians. Study a federal budget, and you understand the soul of a country. Is roughly what he's talking about. So yeah, my paper, which is the struggle for the soul of U.S. capitalism. Why can't we have unions in Michigan? Yeah, of course we can. But business interests, not all of them, but a lot, don't want it. They think they should have lower taxes and they can pay workers less. And that's a decent society as far as they're concerned. And they have a lot of power. And it's not just with the Tea Party. And it's not even just with the Republican Party. I'm sure I don't have to remind people at the New School that financial deregulation that led to the crisis would never have happened if not for the support of the Democratic Party. Bill Clinton, Larry Summers, Robert Rubin, they were the ones that ushered it through. And then, and in 2001, Larry Summers said, those regulations, that was fine for the 30s. We don't need this anymore. That's old-fashioned stuff. Did he really believe it? I don't know. Maybe he led himself to believe it. But those are the forces. Wall Street never wanted regulations. From Dodd-Frank, from Glass-Steagall in 1930. They fought regulations. They couldn't get it through. But they finally got it through under Clinton. And this is really what we're up against. What is with the austerity agenda? It's not defensible analytically. Why aren't these people treated the way they should be? Which is, you guys are wrong. You're just really seriously wrong. And we don't need to listen to you anymore. But no, turn on the TV. Reinhardt and Rogoff will be on. John Taylor is on, testifying. It keeps going. And that's because, yes, they represent the interests of people that want these arguments out there. That's mine. I'm not the expert on this. I think, there are many people here. And I know this sounds crude, but it's crude, but approximately true. That's what I think.
Just to follow up on that, do you...
mind saying if you have any indication whether the White House staff is aware of your findings?
I mean, it's not that original to me. These are findings from a lot of people, including a lot of people in this room. Yes, some people are. Yeah. Yeah, I like David Howell. I do work with this group, Center for American Progress. It has a direct line to the White House. The head of the Center for American Progress, John Podesta, is now the chief advisor, overall advisor to the president. And that's how I ended up getting to be a consultant to the Energy Department in 2009. It was through that connection. You know, they didn't necessarily hear of me, but John Podesta said, hire this guy, and that's how I got hired. So yeah, they're aware of it. And you know, when I was working on the green parts of the stimulus, it was very clear that this was not going to happen over 2 years, even though it was a 2-year stimulus. We needed 5 years. But the money was taken away because austerity. After 2010, you know, the Republicans took the House and the agenda changed. And, you know, the Democrats fought a little bit. They didn't fight that much. And one of the first things that got taken away was the money for the green parts of the stimulus. And the person that took it away was Larry Summers. And, you know, he said, we need the money for school teachers. And, you know, who's to be, I'm not against money going to school teachers, but that was the framing of we can't keep funding both things, so we're taking it away from green investments. So I think some of them are aware. They should be more aware. I think there's a lot of great people working in Washington. Mostly, you know, people with the progressive caucus in Congress. There are good people at like think tanks. Like there are really excellent people at the Center for American Progress and other places. But it's really hard to get the agenda through. And my view of Obama is, you know, he's a politician. He's in the middle. He's a gatekeeper, and he's not going to do something that is going to really antagonize the 1%. He can talk about it, but he's not ready to. We have to mobilize to make that happen. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. I think the reality is, or what I'm sensing is that a lot of the opposition to a lot of these policies is coming from academic economics at large right now. So my question is, what do you think the possibilities are for a shift in academic economics towards a more Heilbronian approach to the discipline? Do you think it's possible, and what do you think it would take to instigate such a shift in how the discipline is carried out?
Great question. I wish I knew the answer. You know, when the crisis started, I think I wrote this on more than one occasion that whatever else is going to be, you know, kind of the neoliberal agenda. When I was in graduate school here a long time ago, Professor David Gordon was developing this concept of the social structure of accumulation, and which basically tries to define that we're not just talking about capitalism, we're talking about you know, there are different kinds of capitalism. Slightly imaginary Sweden, we would call you know, a more desirable egalitarian version of capitalism. Neoliberalism, I'd call a much more aggressive pro-business, less desirable version. So at the time when I was a graduate student, we were recognizing that the post-war social democratic version of capitalism was in a crisis. That was clear. And we were debating why and what would come next. Well, the one thing I remember, nobody ever said, what's coming next is, you know, a much more aggressive pro-capitalist version that's, you know, it was really like, can we move towards socialism was kind of the issue at hand and how to get there. So exactly the opposite happened. So that speaks well of my powers of prescience and prediction. So I thought neoliberalism was totally discredited in 2008. And intellectually, I think it is. But it's going to take a lot to dislodge it. And in the meantime, it's, you know, it's a very small scale. You can see this fight because you have these people like the John Taylors or like the Reinhardt and Rogoffs. Somehow it doesn't matter that much if they're wrong. They just keep going. And they have this kind of halo around them. And they're important people. They're people you can trust. And if they're wrong, well, they were probably right, you know, all these other times. So that's the way the profession runs. The only, you know, it's very frustrating, but it seems to me the only way to fight it is through doing better research, being inspired by, you know, I love the quote because it says, you know, we're really about morality, but we have to have a workable science. So it is a lot of work. And, you know, Karl Marx said there's no royal road to science, and only those who do not dread the fatiguing climbs up its summits have a chance of achieving its luminous peaks. So you do have to do the work. And that's why places like the New School are more important than ever. And it's great that you have such fantastic faculty and programs. And it is a struggle, and we keep chipping away. And there are periods of historic breaks. So if I want to quote somebody else, Milton Friedman said, the only time things ever really change is during crises. But what you have to do as a researcher is prepare yourself for the crisis by having a body of knowledge that is capable of addressing the crisis. And that's, I think, what the job of people like us progressive economists are doing.
Well, thank you very much for your... Well, thank you very much for your talk. I have here the New York Times with me. There's an article about Janet Yellen, a talk she gave to the House Committee on Financial Services. I was just wondering if you could comment on some of the policies she's been discussing.
Yeah. I think, you know, talking about the realm of realism, like only slightly imaginary Sweden and a workable science out of morality, within the realm of possibility, Janet Yellen is a fantastic choice for chair of the Fed. I'm extremely happy. I think she is truly a first-rate scientist. I think she cares about morality. She wants to fight unemployment. I know she really cares. So, and she's not a tool of Wall Street. She never was. She was never paid by Wall Street. How often does this happen? Never, actually. So, you know, within the realm of what's possible, it's the best possible choice that ever could have emerged. And by the way, that only emerged out of struggle, too, because Obama's choice was clearly Larry Summers, who is nothing if not a tool of Wall Street. And he's a perfect tool because he is smart and he has credentials and he can sell himself as something else, but he knows who his boss is, and he behaves in that way. So Yellen has made it clear that she wants to continue a stimulus. The thing that troubles me, there's two things. Their goal was to get unemployment down to 6.5%. We're almost there, officially, as I saw, but it's not really 6.5% because we still have, you know, 21 million people are underemployed, and we've lost 14 million jobs if we just look at the employment population to ratio. How much she's going to be able to continue to maintain the focus on unemployment in light that the official number is 6.6 is difficult. On top of that, I don't think that she's using all the tools at hand. That's why I mentioned this other one. And again, this isn't just me, and it's not even just liberals. I mean, Blinder, who is a liberal, has made this case for this taxing excess reserves in the Wall Street Journal multiple times. So how exactly you do it, we can debate, but this should be in the toolkit. Because you're looking at 14% of GDP. This is not a trivial thing. This is gigantic. Do something with it. She hasn't brought it up. I don't know, that maybe she feels it's impossible to do so. Blinder, the last time Blinder wrote about this in the Wall Street Journal, I can't even remember. He was saying he was very encouraged because there was like 2 words in a recent Fed communique, which, see you, Jeff, which said something to the effect that we're concerned about this number. Something, it was just like, and Blinder said, you know, when the Fed even says that, it's a big deal. So maybe they are thinking, but it's a tool that's there. And actually, you could mobilize conservatives. You should. Why? It does not affect the federal budget. You could say, well, we're talking about increasing taxes. You don't even have to do it through a tax. You can just call it an excess or maximum reserve requirement. There is a minimum reserve requirement. You could say there's a maximum reserve requirement that the commercial banks cannot have more than whatever, 10% of their loans in reserves. And anything over that, they're going to have to pay back to the Fed. And so you wouldn't even have to go through Congress. She could do it. And it would be good for small, it would be, first of all, good for small business that Republicans, that's all they say they're for. And they would have no budgetary effects. So I would love to see, and I'm not saying this is the only thing she should do, but we know that what they've been doing, which is the quantitative easing, which is buying long-term bonds, it's had some effect. Holding the interest rate at 0 has had positive effects, but it hasn't been enough, and it's not going to be. Yeah, Rick.
So we had Robert Gordon. The mic is out apparently, so I'll just talk loud. Recently, Robert Gordon was here, and he echoed the theme that Summers and others have said as well. That we're entering this you alluded to before, this long-term period of secular stagnation. The economy just hasn't brought the growth potential that it used to have, and we're just going to have to sort of buckle down and recognize we're not going to get growth rates like this. So this is kind of a backdoor justification for austerity. We just haven't got the horses to do it. Whatever might have used to work under stimulus and Keynesian type policies doesn't work anymore for all these long-term structural factors. So get used to below 2% growth and not much job rates, and the normal unemployment rate's going to be 6.5%, 7%. I don't know if you're following that debate, but I'd be curious about your comments about that. I mean, there's both an intellectual problem there, but they're sort of giving up, right, in a way, saying we can't get it anymore. There's a long history in economic thought about secular stagnation that they don't seem to be into, but it's sort of seeding the growth field in a way
that's
to the conservatives. So I'm just curious.
It's a good point, that they're seeding the growth field. Well, the idea of long-term stagnation, of course, starts from the left. I guess you could say it was what Schumpeter was talking about it. Certainly, Paul Sweezy, who was my professor here, also my very first semester at the New School. I had a great lineup. I mean, my first semester, I had David Gordon and Paul Sweezy. My second semester, I had Ed Nell, Anwar Sheikh. And just kept going from there. So, so Sweezy certainly was arguing that, but Sweezy at least also said there are countervailing forces that can, fight against stagnation. He wasn't necessarily favoring them, and he said one of them was military spending, and he said another one was, the sales effort, advertising. So, the issue is, what is the policy environment that you create? If we are going to assume that the economy works for Wall Street, that we aren't putting any regulations on Wall Street, that we are not forcing funds getting channeled to productive investments, that we are not going to engage to a significant degree in public infrastructure investments, that we are not interested in supporting small business development, even if we say we are. Okay, but if you do all these other things which are within the realm of possibility, then I don't think that it's true. I mean, you may say that we're not going to get to 4% growth, but we don't need 4% growth. And I mean, to me, again, the environmental imperative is the biggest one, and you know, the only way to get, I don't agree with the idea that the way you control climate change is stopping economic growth. Actually, quite the opposite. I think that you need to spend in the range of 1.5% of GDP per year, and that includes GDP getting bigger. And then you can get, and these are almost very high proportion domestic jobs, and it's expanding, it's creating new sectors and new work for all kinds of people, including, you know, roofers, including truck drivers, including scientists. It's a transformative agenda in the way that Ednell and Sweezy and Schumpeter talked about a transformative agenda. That's really how I got into the subject in the first place. I was not initially just thinking of it as a question about environment. I was thinking about transformational growth. And Sweezy, Schumpeter talk about epoch-making innovations, and this one I see as an epoch-making innovation. So, yeah, over, yeah.
Again, you'll have to speak up, because we don't have a mic.
Well, thank you, first of all, Professor Pollin. That was illuminating.
Speak up.
I hope I was, okay, I can speak very loud, so that's good. So my question is, I can't help but read this quote and think about the article that Professor Raj Shetty from Harvard University published in the fall of 2013 about economics being a science and sort of its similarity to the natural sciences. And so it seems to me like this notion of our discipline being a science can be very paradoxical in a sense that can lead us to believe that we can really pinpoint social phenomena as, you know, to a very precise point. But then, I don't know, it confuses me. So I'd like to get your take on that. And maybe what's at stake here is that perhaps what we have to keep in mind is that embedded in issues of economics and other social sciences are matters of fairness and justice. So is that really how do we move forward from there?
Well, I'm not as familiar with the details of his research as David Howell, who did a blog on Chetty's thing. You want to address Chetty, or do we have time or not?
The notion of economics is a science.
Okay. Well, look, I agree with.
This was an op-ed, and actually my class is here. Maybe they should talk about it. We talked about it last week in class. It was an op-ed supporting the notion that economics is in fact science, and he cited a lot of his own work in support of that, and used randomized controlled trials as the representative the example of science.
Yeah.
It's a very, which seems to me from a New School perspective, really narrow. For certain questions call for that kind of methodology, but certainly economics as science can be viewed as a much broader, bigger picture. Whatever.
Students want to speak to that?
I mean, I would agree with David. Actually, I was the one who brought it up in class in a way.
Okay.
So it was funny that you bring it up too. And I'm not an economist, so I can criticize economists as much as I want. No, I thought the idea was very narrow, and was like what I said also in class and to David was the idea that, you know, why economics try to be a natural science while they're not, you know. You never see that from political science or sociology. They never claim to have the pure truth or the laboratory-like truth, if you want. So, I think this quote is very interesting in the sense that there is this idea of morality behind it. So, would it be, in a sense, would it be better or a way to demystify economics by accepting this moral basis, in a sense, while at the same time trying to be as much as we can objective in terms of the scientific tools or the research that we use, but saying out loud that, you know, we are actually, you know, this is the agenda and we have an agenda behind it. But we try to stay objective in a way, so I don't know.
I think we'll leave it at that. That's good. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you for being so honest on these issues. I work with the UN NGO community. Do you think it's really, and the issues of values which you bring up, well, is a real, economics is a real issue of values, who gets what when. And is it really in businesses' interest to blow off the environment in terms of unintended consequences, or in terms of their use, in terms of some of the risk analysis insurance companies are increasingly having to deal with? If cities are blown away, go underwater, doesn't that affect business?
Yeah, I'm sure it does.
Distribution lanes?
Actually, I was having a really interesting conversation this morning with Ariel Rubenstein. Many of you may know him as an outstanding game theorist, half the year at NYU. And we were talking about exactly this issue. And he said, you know, we were talking about this research I'm doing. He said, yeah, great research, Bob, but nothing's going to happen until 1 million people die. And he said, I don't like that, but that's, he said, that's the reality. And so your scenario, if you know cities start to get flooded, and then maybe we'll take this seriously. My own aim in doing the research on a green agenda is to try to get us to controlling climate change before 1 million people die. I'm certainly not the first one to think of that, but I actually, the point of all this work I've done on this for the last 5 or 6 years is to try to show that a green, there's, of course, oil companies are not going to they're going to make a lot less money. That's a given. But overall, it's not going to slow down GDP growth. It is going to create more job opportunities. It is a transformational agenda. So most everybody should be for it. Coal miners should logically be against it. But it's easy to address if we want to make a workable science out of morality. It's easy to address the concerns of coal miners. The late great labor leader and environmentalist Tony Mazzocchi had a solution, and he called it a super fund for workers. And he said, we have super funds for dirt, so let's have a super fund for workers, and let's make it viable for coal miners to transition to other jobs. And then we don't have that resistance to a green agenda from, okay, yes, the businesses are going to make less money. Phone companies, traditional phone companies, are making a whole lot less money because of cell phone technology. That's the way it is. That's what happens when you invest under risk, or more fundamentally, under uncertainty. And they're going to have to deal with that. And the part of the political struggle is pushing that idea through. But otherwise, there is, in general, there is nothing for anybody to fear in terms of growth opportunities, job opportunities through the transition to a green economy. So that's a point that I hope somehow penetrates.
I think we should stop there. And Bob, you've given us a positive vision for our future. You've given us a research agenda for the work here and for at the University of Massachusetts-Amherst elsewhere. And you gave us a mission statement that came from here that we can now spread everywhere. So thanks for the vision and thanks for the research topics, everyone. Thanks very much. Super fun for workers. That's wonderful.